On behalf of the Worcester Business Journal, my name is Peter Stanton. I'm the publisher of the Worcester Business Journal. On behalf of the Worcester Business Journal and our staff and our sponsors, presenting sponsor National Grid, and supporting sponsors Absolute Green Energy, Bowditch & Dewey, and Conover & Company, and all 15 of our exhibitors, we'd like to welcome you all here this morning for a timely discussion about the current state and the future of solar energy here in Massachusetts. We're thrilled to have a terrific set of panelists and moderators, and our promise at these events and our hope is that you will all come away with valuable insights, some new information, and some contacts that you can put to use. I'm not great at the officialdom of this, but I do want to recognize, I do know we have an important public official here or is elected official in State Senator Jamie Eldridge, who's sitting at the front table. I just wanted to recognize Jamie. Thank you for coming this morning. So, anyways, we've got a tight program and I think some terrific panels, and I know that a lot of you have had the chance to visit with the exhibitors out in the hallway, and hopefully you did so this morning, and you'll have some time, maybe, if not in between the sessions afterwards, to also visit a lot of those interesting companies that are working on some exciting projects in the state. So without further ado, I would like to ask Aleta Fazzone, the Director of Community and Customer Management at National Grid, to come up for a few comments. Thank you, Aleta.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Peter. Again, I'm Aleta Fazzone, and on behalf of National Grid here in Central Massachusetts, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this morning for this special summit. National Grid and the Worcester Business Journal have partnered together a number of times over the last 5 years or so on energy-related events. And while they give us a lot of credit as their key partner, they do the lion's share of the work, or maybe even all of it. And so I'd just like to give a special thank you to Peter and Chris Prosser and Bonnie and the entire Worcester Business Journal team for the tremendous amount of effort, as all of you know, if you've planned one of these events, that goes into arranging them. It's evident by the crowd that we have gathered here this morning that solar is one of the hottest topics going right now, and given that National Grid is committed to being a leading advocate of solar generation in the Northeast, we're really pleased to be one of the primary sponsors of this event. And we're here not only to support the Commonwealth in its goals to advance solar as a renewable energy source within the framework of the Green Communities Act, but also because as longtime stewards of the communities in which we operate, National Grid is committed to safeguarding our environment for a more sustainable energy future. So we're very excited to be a big part of this booming industry, and I thought I'd just share with you a quick couple of statistics related to this business at National Grid in Massachusetts. The number of interconnection applications that we've received has practically tripled in just about a 2-year period. And that number approached 1,000 applications for more than 300 megawatts of distributed generation capacity just within the last year. 98% of those applications are for solar power installations. And because I don't want to ignore the elephant in the room, we do recognize the challenge that I'm sure some of you may have had in getting your particular interconnection application processed and approved, and let me assure you that we're working very hard to address that challenge and reduce the bottleneck that's been created, quite frankly, by the absolute deluge of applications that we've received. In an effort to do our own part and walk the talk, we have installed a 225 kW photovoltaic panel system, I should say, on the roof of our headquarters building in Waltham, which in itself is a platinum level LEED certified facility. And that solar system generates approximately 5% of the building's energy needs. And our effort hasn't stopped there. We've also constructed, and we now own and operate about 5 megs of solar generation on 5 of our other facilities throughout the state. So that's it from my National Grid infomercial. We have a fabulous program and a great crowd, and those are two of the key ingredients to have a great event. I know you're anxious to get started, and it just figures that the day that we plan a solar summit, that the sun is nowhere to be seen. But hopefully if we talk about it long enough today, it'll come back into view. So thanks again for being here. I hope you learn a lot and have a great day.
Thanks, Aleta. I just want to say we do actually lean on National Grid as part of our brain trust quite a bit. I know Aleta and Tim Rowan and their team has been very helpful as we've sort of done energy-related events over the years, and certainly this one. And I also want to say, working with Chris Prosser, our events manager, that a lot of our panelists and moderators have been critical in helping us put together this program, especially John DeVillers, who I know wasn't able to be here at the last minute, but was sort of a nice unpaid consultant helping us put this together. So thank you to everybody who worked on making this happen. So it is my pleasure, and I know a lot of us are here to hear our keynote speaker and the whole program, to introduce Ian Berwick. In the last several years, the state of Massachusetts has been widely recognized for its national leadership role in a couple of very important areas. The one that is getting the most attention this political season is our healthcare reform, but not far behind has been the state's signature energy legislation, the Green Communities Act. A key player in the creation of the Green Communities Act and a person deeply involved in its implementation over the last 4 years has been Ann Berwick. Ann was appointed to her current position as the chair of the Department of Public Utilities 2 years ago by Governor Patrick. Prior to that, she was the Commonwealth's Undersecretary for Energy and also served as the acting chair of the Energy Facilities Siting Board. In her role with the DPU, Ann has worked with the Department of Energy Resources to introduce more progressive building codes and on the development of renewable resources throughout the state. Ann's previous positions included serving as senior consultant at M.J. Bradley and Associates in Concord, as the chief of Environmental Protection Division in the Mass Attorney General's Office, and in the Alaska Attorney General's Office, where she participated in litigation before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and the U.S. Supreme Court. It says here, insert Sarah Palin bridge to nowhere joke. Sorry, I don't have one. But Ann did mention that when she was there, she actually did get to work with John Roberts, a Supreme Court justice, on some of her legal work there. So she's also been a partner in the litigation department at the Boston law firm of Goulston and Storrs. One of the reasons we have a full house this morning is in no small measure due to the rock star status of our keynote speaker. So it is my great pleasure to welcome to the podium Ann Berwick.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Peter. I would very much like for my children to hear me introduced as a rock star. I'm really honored to be here. It's a pretty unbeatable combination of the commitment of Governor Patrick to the development of renewable resources in the Commonwealth and the people in this room. When the governor took office, you could count the combined total megawatts of solar and wind on 2 hands. At that point, we had just 6 total installed megawatts of both solar and wind in total. 5 years later, we now have 115 megawatts of solar alone. By the end of 2012, we expect to be more than halfway to our 2017 goal of 250 megawatts of solar power in the state. Moreover, in 4 years, we've gone from 100 kilowatts of solar at state facilities to more than 6 megawatts, cutting state energy bills by over $800,000 per year in the process. None of which is to say that it's time to rest on our laurels. From wind siting to the proposed increase in the net metering cap, to the extension of the long-term contracting obligations of the electric utility companies, we need to continue to expand tools to leverage the Commonwealth's leadership in clean energy. On the topic of clean energy leadership, I want to expand a bit on a point Governor Patrick made in a speech a couple of weeks ago. The governor said he had heard enough about Evergreen and Solyndra. I want to add my second to that. Governor Patrick said we are not always going to score, but we are never going to score if we don't get in the game. He went on to observe that he used to work in the oil industry, in which companies, massively subsidized companies, and those are his words, frequently drill dry wells. In fact, the likes of Evergreen and Solyndra are proof of concept. We should fully expect that some reasonable proportion of companies that develop innovative technologies will fail. A piece in the October 10, 2011 issue of the New Yorker magazine reported that venture capitalists expect a third or more of the companies they support to fail. The very reason that these companies need government support is that their focus on new technologies make private funding insufficient, if not entirely unavailable. If the government were batting 1,000 with these companies, then the government would be wasting taxpayer dollars. That would be the situation in which the charge that the government's policy had failed would be fully appropriate. But instead of dwelling on that point, I'd like to take this opportunity to take a deeper dive than usual into a claim you've probably heard quite often, and that I bet you will hear more of in this election season, that renewables are subsidized too heavily. And I guess by too heavily is meant greater subsidies relative to other resources. In my experience, that position is often more about emotion than facts, and I'd like to highlight the facts here. My focus is on fuels that are used primarily to generate electricity, the conventional generation resources like coal, natural gas, and nuclear, and on the renewable side, wind and solar, and on federal rather than on state subsidies. I'm not going to talk about conventional or alternative transportation fuels. Ethanol has, as you probably know, its own quite complicated story. First, renewable generation resources have indeed been heavily subsidized over the last few years. The Energy Information Administration provided a recent snapshot, and that's what you're looking at, distilled, comparing federal electricity production subsidies by sector. Its snapshot, as you'll see, reports that in FY 2010, so this is a one-year FY 2010 snapshot, and that's the latest year they analyzed, electricity-related renewables received 55% of what the EIA calls direct federal subsidies and support. So you'll see renewables, conventional fuels, and transmission and distribution. Wind facilities, wind, received the largest share of direct federal subsidies and support in FY 2010, accounting for 42% of total electricity-related subsidies. Solar received the second largest share of subsidies for renewables, but at only 8% of the total. So what I want to leave you with from this slide is in FY 2010, renewables got very significant federal subsidies. On the one hand, this number does look especially large in light of the fact that renewables accounted for only about 10% of generation in that year. On the other hand, the number is misleadingly high, that is, because the ARA grant program resulted in higher expenditures than would otherwise have been the case in a single subsidy year because of the program's front-loading of subsidy costs. But yes, renewables have begun to receive very significant government support. Whether that will continue remains to be seen, as you know. But the story of significant subsidies for renewables only starts and certainly does not end there. I have 3 points to make in that regard. First, put into appropriate historical perspective, government support for conventional generation resources has absolutely dwarfed support for renewables. And in theory, technology should need support only before they become competitive. But conventional resources continue to attract government support in various forms. 2, the types of subsidies that exist for conventional resources are of higher value than the nominal value of the predominant subsidies for renewables. That is, the investment and the production tax credits. 3, there are, of course, the costs that conventional resources are not required to internalize. Certain environmental, public health, and national security costs. These are challenging to quantify, but the one thing that's crystal clear is that although they are often treated as zero, They are far from zero. Now let's go back to these 3 points in somewhat more detail. Point 1, that's the point about historical perspective. The government support for conventional generation resources has dwarfed support for renewables. According to the Congressional Research Service, a completely neutral source, tax expenditures for renewables, and that's just tax expenditures for renewables, not other forms of government support, such as, for example, the Price-Anderson Act's liability protection for nuclear plants, didn't surpass those for fossil fuels in a single year until 2009. Even then, CRS details that from 1977 to 2010, fossil fuels received tens of billions of dollars more than renewables in the form of tax benefits. And I just want to point out that it's not absolutely clear from the CRS report, but it seems like these numbers include transportation. But you can't tell entirely from the CRS report. But the point totally stands that until 2009 and over the course of history, fossil fuels and nuclear power have received far more support than renewables. Separate from this special tax treatment, renewables also have significant catching up to do in terms of US DOE research and development funding, which has gone in much greater amounts to fossil fuels and nuclear than to renewables. And according to a DBL Investors 2011 report, in inflation-adjusted dollars over the first 15 years of subsidy life, that's an interesting metric, by the way, the first subsidy dollars over the first 15 years of subsidy life. Government support for nuclear power averaged $3.3 billion. Oil and gas subsidies averaged $1.8 billion, and renewables averaged less than $0.4 billion. In other words, nuclear got 8 times the level of support that renewables got over the first 15 years of subsidy life. And the report I just mentioned placed the cumulative subsidies for oil and gas at almost $500 billion from 1918 to 2009. Think as well about government support for large hydro, which some analysts place at $80 billion, TVA, for example. In theory, of course, technology should need support only before they become competitive. That's why DBL is calling out the first 15 years of subsidy life. But conventional resources continue to this day to attract significant government support in various forms. Although they are certainly directionally correct, I would not take any of these numbers to the bank, especially those that track far back in time and require assumptions that we could all certainly debate. For one thing, they tell only part of the story. No one, to my knowledge, has thus far told the full story on electricity-related government support, partly because that would be extremely difficult to do. For example, how would you think about the Price-Anderson Act, which limits the liability of nuclear power plants? How would you apportion the government contribution to TVA as between electricity generation, flood control, and river navigability? So that was number one, the historical perspective. 2, the types of subsidies for conventional resources are of higher value than the nominal value of 2 of the predominant subsidies for renewables, that is, the investment tax credit and the production tax credit. I don't need to tell this group that the start-again, stop-again character of these mechanisms seriously diminishes their value, and I won't dwell on that point. 3, there are many costs that conventional generation resources do not internalize. These are the negative externalities, or social as opposed to private costs. I would not consider the numbers I'm about to share with you to be precise either, though they come from reputable sources, the Brookings Institution, the National Academy of Sciences, and the US Government Interagency Working Group on the Social Cost of Carbon in 2010. I reference these figures only for the point that should be completely uncontroversial, which is that although these costs are not treated as such by markets, they are not zero. Very far from it. Because we don't have broad agreement on the precision of the numbers, they often get treated as though they were zero, and they most certainly are not. So here are the numbers. Non-climate change related damages, $62.7 billion in 2005, mostly from the health effects of air pollution. These numbers relate only to electricity generation and do not include transportation. On the one hand, the amount can be viewed as high or higher than they are now because EPA has promulgated rules since 2005, which is what these figures are for, that have caused the internalization of additional costs. On the other hand, the fact that the estimate reflects only coal and natural gas means that it is lower than it would be if all conventional generation resources were included. Climate change related, so that was just non-climate damages and mostly air pollution related damages. Climate change related damages from US CO2 emissions globally, that is, the effect of US CO2 emissions worldwide, $120 billion in 2010. I don't have this broken out for non-transport sources, so this includes, this is a greater number than the damages associated just with electricity generation. That's true for the climate number, but not for the non-climate number. These figures don't include many of the impacts of conventional generation, such as the environmental impacts attributable to strip mining and the loss of life associated with mining and drilling accidents. These numbers also do not include any of the Defense Department costs of securing our sources of gas and oil in unstable areas of the world. The defense-related externalities are higher for mobile sources than for electricity generation because of the relatively greater reliance of mobile sources on oil. But these defense-related externalities certainly exist in some amount for electricity generation as well. In summary, let's go back to the inquiry in question, that is, whether renewable electricity generation resources are heavily subsidized relative to other electricity generation resources. Historically, that is certainly not the case. I would argue that the magnitude of these externalities is such that even in the short term, and even on a kilowatt-hour basis, renewables are not heavily subsidized as compared to fossil and nuclear generation. And I realize that I have not taken into account the positive externalities associated with solar power, which include a relatively very large number of jobs per megawatt hour. Such externalities are often seen as abstract concepts, hard to quantify, but in this setting I suspect it's easy. Raise your hand if you've gotten a job in the solar industry in Massachusetts or transferred here from elsewhere in the last 4 or 5 years. Okay, you guys with your hands up are positive externalities. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the rest of the conference. And I think we have 5 minutes or so, maybe a little bit more, to try for 10 for me to answer questions if I'm able to.
What's the administration's thoughts on the possible tariff on Chinese solar panels? What, between 98% of the applications are on solar. That would drastically affect that.
Yeah. So I mean, the administration hasn't taken a position on that. I mean, personally, I'm well aware of the risks or the problems associated with that, but I can't say the administration has. The administration has not taken a position.
When you talk about 120 billion, I'm sorry, when you talk about 120 billion in global damages, does that include any health risks, to the public and things like that, or is that basically just environmental?
Yeah, no, it includes both health and environmental damages. So, for example, the costs associated with malaria, more exposure to malaria, dengue fever, those kinds of things, and also heat-related deaths.
And
Yes.
if Okay. And? Oh, okay. If 400 megawatts represents 1% of capacity, when will the Commonwealth move to supporting 2% of capacity with solar? Because 1% is large enough to be a bug to be squished.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Commonwealth's clean energy policies in general don't stop with 250 megawatts or 400 megawatts. We want to move the Commonwealth towards much greater reliance on distributed generation, renewables of various kinds, not just solar. I mean, because there was a 250 megawatt goal for 2017 and a program that anticipates 400 megawatts by 2020, doesn't mean we want to stop there. Absolutely not. Yes?
But isn't the SREC program going to stop there?
Well, I'm going to let, so the DPU doesn't, it's DOER, the Department of Energy Resources, that implements the SREC program. And I'm going to let that, and we at the DPU actually don't implement the SREC program. And so we implement, for example, the net metering cap. And so I'm going to ask, maybe Bram can address that question. Do you want to take it right now?
Yeah, so I'm Bram from DOER. I'm sure, and I was expecting that we would talk about that in the panel discussion. So we can talk about it more extensively then, but I think for a very short answer, the 400 megawatts is the goal of the solar carve-out program as it stands right now. We hear that people start talking about what might come after that. That's a discussion that we'll definitely go after that. But solar will definitely not stop there. But I'm sure we can talk about it more during the panel discussion.
Okay, since I have a microphone, let me just sort of summarize what Bram said. So Bram was from the Department of Energy Resources, which is the agency in the Commonwealth that implements the SREC program. And Bram intends to speak more about the SREC program in his presentation. But what he said, and fully reflects, I think, the views of the Patrick administration, that the Patrick administration has set some interim goals for solar, and for wind, by the way. 250 megawatts by 2017. The SREC program anticipates 400 megawatts by 2020. But those are the interim goals. There's no intention to stop there. If we're going to, if the world is going to get to the 2050 levels of carbon in the of CO2 of carbon in the atmosphere that we need to get to in order to avoid massive damage to the planet, then we have to see those as only interim goals. And as we go forward, the goals have got to change.
Okay, question over here.
Hi, good morning, and thank you. What would you say is the present ratio of conventional subsidies versus renewable subsidies, in your opinion?
Yeah, for electricity as opposed to transportation, it's the number is at 55%. So in FY 2010, which is the most recent data we have for federal subsidies for electricity generation, renewables get 55% of the pie. And conventional generation gets something less than 45%. And the reason those two numbers don't add up to 100% is because $1 billion plus went to distribution and subsidies for distribution and transmission. So, but the answer is renewables get slightly more than half of federal subsidies. Renewables for electricity generation get slightly more than half of federal direct tax subsidies in FY 2010. Over the course of history, the subsidies for renewables gets absolutely swamped. And in the first 15 years of subsidy life, for various conventional resources get much, much more than renewables do. Does that sort of summarize it for you?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
My hometown has just passed legislation that in the zoning that would eliminate anybody putting a windmill. And a lot of towns are working on this. I see there's battles going on solar. Does your office have any basic guidelines that the towns could use for getting people that don't really understand renewable energy, passing laws that prohibit them from the future, and that would be a great help to a lot of the communities.
Yeah, so you're talking about wind specifically.
Wind and solar.
Yeah.
We've seen solar installations shot down recently because they don't want them in their backyard and not understanding, even on rooftop solar stuff.
You've actually seen them shut down.
Yes.
Yeah.
In our own neighboring towns in Western Mass, particularly in the hills, also on the windmills, they're getting shot down everywhere.
Yeah. So the Patrick administration supports a wind siting bill, which would have addressed these problems, and it hasn't passed the legislature. And we continue to support that bill because it puts reasonable guidelines and reasonable municipal control, but not veto on siting wind. And I'm afraid, I think we've seen the results of not having that legislation, which is that it is very, very difficult to site onshore wind. And it's obviously, as you all know, the story, also quite difficult to site offshore wind. So without that wind siting legislation, I think it's going to continue in the Commonwealth to be really difficult to site wind in particular. I know there are some problems siting solar. It's not, I don't think it's nearly the problem that siting wind is. Yes?
You were commenting on the net metering cap earlier, and that's obviously a concern of all of us. Why is there such a disparity between that and the goals of the program on the carve-out? And why does it take so long to get the net metering cap raised?
Well, I mean, the Green Communities Act, first of all, the Patrick administration supports raising the net metering cap to 6%, which is in pending legislation passed by the Senate. The Green Communities Act was passed in July of 2008 with a 1% net metering cap. In October of 2010, that cap was raised to a total of 3%. 1% for private projects, 2% for public projects. Now here we are in mid-2012 with 6% being contemplated. So I wouldn't actually say that's a very slow story for raising the net metering cap. It went in 2 years. It tripled by legislative action, which we supported, in 2 years. And a doubling from there 2 years later is now being contemplated. So I think the story legislatively on net metering is actually not a bogged down one.
And last question here.
2 questions, if you don't mind. Does Massachusetts contemplate getting involved with legislation similar to New Jersey, where solar development or renewable development would be classified in an inherently beneficial use, thereby reducing local control over zoning restrictions? The other question is, the way solar or renewable are going, the goals for 2017 and 2020 are going to be reached way before those dates. And what's Massachusetts' plan for addressing that?
Let me take the second question first, which is, as I said earlier, the Patrick administration, although, you know, this administration is not going to be in place in 2020. That seems pretty obvious. But the intention of the Patrick administration is to start steering this ship, this ocean liner, in the direction of far heavier reliance on renewable resources than we see currently. As I said earlier, there's no intention to stop at 250 or 400 megawatts. Everybody in the Patrick administration recognizes that to get to a safe level of carbon in the atmosphere in 2050, which is what everybody's talking about, whatever the number is, 350 parts per million or something of that nature, we're going to have far more renewable generation as we go forward than 400 megawatts of solar. And by the way, the Patrick administration goal for wind in 2020 is 2,000 megawatts. So nobody's talking about stopping at those numbers. We're talking about interim goals. And then the first question was, what do we contemplate legislatively with respect to the issue of local control of renewables? And that, as I said, we support the wind siting bill, which certainly does not eliminate local control of wind, but would put a sort of reasonable process in place to allow wind projects to go forward much more easily than they're currently able to. Now they're really, in many cases, as the observation was made, they're really stalled out. Okay, I think we're done. One more question?
One more. One more, if you'd like.
Yeah, right here.
Right here.
I can be loud, that's okay. Briefly, as a private solar developer, what we hear from investors outside the Commonwealth is a concern that our SREC program was made by legislative and policy action and can be unmade. As we've all seen in the Midwest, the political actions and recall elections. Could you speak to investor concerns about the long-term stability of our program?
Yeah, I mean, and again, Bram is going to address the SREC program, but the fact of the matter is, in the real world, things can change. The legislature can change the law, and the administration can change the regulations. And that's true for absolutely every law and all regulations. But I think the fact that the SREC program is embodied in law, not just regulations, not guidelines, but law, and further embodied in regulations, makes it highly unlikely that in any relevant time period it will get undone. And I think we just have to recognize reality, which is that all laws can change. But as I say, the fact that it's in law, not just regulations, certainly not guidelines, makes it, I think, makes reliance on it completely prudent. Yeah.
So Ian, thank you so much for coming. That was terrific. We're going to move right to our next panel, but before I do, I'm going to give Ian a beautiful picture book of Central Massachusetts, and thank her again for her comments and for coming out here this morning. Thank you again. Okay, don't go anywhere. I've got to find my next introduction. Aha! I found it. So, sitting to my left is none other than David O'Connor, who is Senior Vice President for Energy and Clean Technologies at ML Strategies, LLC, and is the moderator of our next panel. I'm going to introduce David, and he will bring the rest of the panelists up. So, in his role as Senior VP for Energy and Clean Technology at ML Strategies, a subsidiary of the law firm Mintz-Levin, David O'Connor helps energy and technology companies shape, navigate emerging legislation, policies, and regulations in a way that will expand their markets and accelerate their growth. His clients include companies that deliver energy efficiency services, develop wind, solar, and biomass power plants, install transmission and smart grid technologies, and bring new low-carbon fuels and offsets to the marketplace. David previously served as the Commissioner of the Massachusetts Division of Energy Resources from 1995 to 2007, where he directed energy efficiency and renewable energy programs and helped develop the first ever multi-state agreement to cap and trade power plant carbon emissions. So please welcome David O'Connor as the moderator of our first panel. Thank you, David.
Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here and happy to have such a great turnout for this event. I think it indicates just how much is happening here in Central Mass and how much interest there is in renewable energy and solar particularly. It's my pleasure to be the moderator of this panel, and the next panel that we have is going to be one where we'll have basically a conversation. The panelists have been specifically directed by the conference organizers not to prepare PowerPoint presentations, so we're really just going to have a conversation. And so I'm going to let the panelists make a few remarks to get us going. I've got a few questions in mind for them, and then we're going to open it up to you. So please, let's follow on the questions we've just had with some more, and perhaps a little bit more specifically focused in on solar development activity. And that's what the panel we have here is. We want to give you essentially an update on solar activity here in the Commonwealth, and I think we've got three outstanding speakers to address that, and they actually, as you'll see, really cover a broad spectrum of views. We're going to have a government public policy sort of perspective from the Department of Energy Resources. We're going to have a utility perspective from the company that, one of the companies that's responsible for purchasing solar RECs when they're produced and is also in the business of developing solar. And then we're going to hear from a representative of a solar development company. So we've really got, I think, a nice range of views, people with really solid experience, really on the ground, developing, administering, regulating solar activities. Should be very informative for you. So with that, let me invite my three panelists to come on up here and do some introductions. To my immediate left is Bram Claeys. Bram is Director of Renewable Energy Policy at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, where he's responsible for developing new renewable and alternative energy policies for the Commonwealth. He brings to that position 12 years of experience in European and international energy and climate policy making to his role at DOER. As a policy advisor to the energy minister in Belgium, he developed innovative policy to support renewable energy and increase the energy efficiency of industrial manufacturing. He also served on the coordinating committee when Belgium held the presidency of the European Union and served as a delegate to the 2010 meeting of the European Union and U.S. Energy Council. So I think Bram has the opportunity not only to tell us about what is happening here in Massachusetts, but also to put it in a broader global context for us, which will be quite interesting. Tim Roughan is the Director of Energy and Environmental Policy at National Grid. There he's held positions as Director of Product Management, Vice President for Business Services, Director of Distributed Resources. So he's really had a long range of experience. Tim has worked at National Grid for almost 3 decades, so he's really seen it all from a utility perspective. In his current role, Tim resolves distributed generation issues of all kinds, having to do with net metering, integration of renewable energy into the transmission and distribution system, interconnection policies, and so forth. He also promotes the development of customer-side resources that can defer or delay the need to upgrade and transmission and distribution capacity. John Abe, far end, is Senior Vice President at Nexamp, Inc., where he is in charge of marketing, regulatory affairs, and trading. He's also General Manager of Nexamp Capital, which administers Nexamp's solar assets. During his tenure at Nexamp, the company's annual solar installation base has grown from less than 200 kilowatts in 2007 to over 8 megawatts in 2011. Prior to joining Nexamp, he worked at the Massachusetts Technology Collaborative, where he managed the $68 million Commonwealth Solar Program and the large on-site renewable energy initiative, which developed distributed wind, hydro, and biomass projects. So I've asked our speakers each to make some opening remarks and kind of set the stage for our conversation. And I've asked Bram to go first, really to try to provide a clear sort of picture of the overarching regulatory framework for solar development. And I've asked him to do that in recognition of the fact that some of you in the audience have been working in solar development for years now and are deeply experienced and perhaps know a lot about the regulatory regime. But there are certainly others here who are not as experienced, who are new to thinking about solar, who are wondering about whether this is a resource that might make sense for their company, whether they want to get involved in installing solar and so forth. So we want to go back and just make sure that we cover the basics here, get everybody on the same, if you will, same page with respect to the framework in which all this activity is going on, and then we'll get into some of the more detailed questions later on in the program. So with that, let me let you, Bram, go ahead and get us started.
Thank you, David, and good morning all, and thank you for having us, and definitely commend the organizers for putting this together. It's an excellent initiative, and glad to see so many people here in the room. I'll try to give in a couple of minutes an overview of where we come from in Massachusetts, and I think one of the main messages that I hope to convey to you all is how Massachusetts legislators have tried to build a stable solar market here in the state with thoughtful and step-by-step development of policies in order to have an environment that can foster, that can really have a solar development that is sustainable over the years and is not a bust and boom phenomenon as we've seen in some other places. So the Patrick administration very early on recognized that it was very important to grow solar as part of the renewable energy mix. Solar is, of course, not the only renewable energy source, and the renewable portfolio standard that has been established in Massachusetts aims at achieving 15% of electricity by 2020 from different renewable sources, and solar is one of them. Governor Patrick very early set a goal of developing 250 megawatts of solar PV in 2017. We've heard that goal being referenced by Chair Berwick already a couple of times this morning. And that was the starting point for developing policies to make that happen. First thing that was put in place was a very extensive rebate program, the Commonwealth Solar Program, which was administered by the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, or what is today called the Clean Energy Center. Many here in the room have a longer institutional memory of all the institutions here in the state, so forgive me for using shorthand references. But that Commonwealth Solar, first phase Commonwealth Solar Program established 27 megawatts of solar in the end in the state. And that's predating the solar carve-out when it was established. So the Commonwealth Solar ended in end of 2009. The Green Communities Act, which was approved in 2008, introduced the idea of having a special carve-out for certain technologies that we wanted to have extra support for. And following the Green Communities Act, the administration designed what is now the solar carve-out, which came into effect in 2010. The solar carve-out is a very innovative program. Many other states are looking at it as something that is unique and something that is very inspirational. And we hear that it's actually something that attracts a lot of investors to the state. It's a carve-out from the RPS Class 1 and functions as, or is governed by, on the one hand, an ACP, alternative compliance payment level, which is the penalty that retail suppliers have to pay if they do not meet the minimum standard that they have to meet every year. And that functions effectively as a ceiling price. That level was initially set at a certain level and was kept there. At some point, the OER saw that that level was what was thought to be too high, was subsequently lowered to $550 per megawatt hour, and that caused some concern in the market that created unpredictability. DOER listened to that, and we established a long-term vision of how the alternative compliance payment levels will evolve over 10 years. I think that was an important improvement. So we have long-term vision of what the ceiling price of the solar carve-out program will be. The lower level of the value of the solar RECs is set by an auction mechanism, which will function as a mechanism of last resort. The idea of the solar carve-out is to have the market, the solar REC market, work. But if there's SRECs that do not get sold, they can be deposited into the auction account, and then we organize an auction, and the minimum price in that auction is $300, 285 of which go to the seller of the RECs. Now that effectively works as the bottom of the value for the SRECs. So the SREC market is expected to work between the bottom and the ceiling price. So that is in very short how it works. It's a lot more complicated than that. We can get into more details if you want. It's been very successful in attracting new investors to the state. We've seen a very rapid growth of installations in the state. We now have 110 megawatts of solar installed. Remember, 27 of those were pre-existing, so the solar carve-out has effectively added about 75 megawatts. And we see a lot more in the development. So we think that the solar carve-out was successful, and we expect that the 400 megawatts where the solar carve-out is trying to get us at will be achieved not next year, but we definitely see the 400 megawatts on the horizon, and it's very hard to predict when exactly that will be happening. Solar carve-out main program. However, I also want to highlight two other programs that we're using together with our close colleagues of the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. We have still ongoing the Commonwealth Solar 2 program, which adds to the production-based incentive of the solar carve-out, also a rebate to people that want to install solar PV on their roof or small ground-mounted systems. Also been very successful, but we're gradually decreasing the value of that rebate as we see a lesser or a decreasing need for that rebate. And then another important new program is Solarize Mass, where we try to help residential customers by grouping them in group purchases, get a better price for PV, and that's generating a lot of excitement. Started last year with a couple of communities, and we've been rolling that out to many more communities this year. It's actually starting up now. PV installers are being selected by the different communities, and we expect that to generate a lot of interest, additional interest to PV. So in short, we've seen good success. We listen to market players, and I look forward to discussion also today, and are definitely committed to keeping the market healthy and to keep it going in the future. So any concerns are taken very seriously and taken into consideration. But maybe I'll leave it to
Bram, thanks very much. So just to perhaps step back and make sure that everyone is clear on the big picture here, what Massachusetts has in this program is what would be called a production incentive. So a customer has to actually have a solar system installed, and it has to be working and producing electricity. And when it does that, the customer receives, if you will, rewards for having effectively produced renewable energy, as opposed to other kinds of mechanisms that might, for example, pay someone to install the solar system, buy, if you will, buy down the cost of installing the capacity. So that creates some interesting sort of problems for a technology that has high upfront costs, which solar does. No fuel cost to speak of, but significant upfront costs. So we're going to hear a little bit more as we go along about that. But the other thing I want to mention is that this is a market that is essentially created by government mandate insofar as every retail electricity supplier in the Commonwealth has to demonstrate every year that they've purchased a certain amount of renewable energy, and within that broad category of renewable energy, they also have to demonstrate that they purchased a specific portion of that supply from solar systems. So it is the retail suppliers of electricity. That would be, if it's a utility company, it would be the utility in its role as providing basic service, which is the case for many residential customers, or a competitive energy supplier that might be serving businesses and industries, perhaps. They also have to demonstrate that a percentage of their supply comes from renewables and from solar as well. So these are the entities, ultimately, that are out in the market purchasing these credits in order to be able to demonstrate to the Department of Energy Resources at the end of any given year that they achieved their requirements. So that's how the market, if you will, comes into play. Now, at the point at which anyone might produce a solar REC, they don't have to sell it directly to those ultimate compliance entities. They can sell it to a third party, an aggregator or a broker of some kind, who then in turn can sell it to them. So it's a free market, if you will, for trading those credits. But at the end of the day, if you will, when the music stops, it's the retail electricity suppliers that have to have sufficient credits to be able to demonstrate that they're in compliance. That's the role, actually, that Tim's company plays, and I want to let Tim talk about Grid and its role in this market.
Great, thank you so much, David, for having me here, and thank you to the crowd for attending. As was mentioned earlier by Peter, we've been very strong supporters of this sort of thing with the Business Journal, and we are one of the larger retail suppliers in Massachusetts. We do have approximately 3,000 megawatts of basic service load, and so we are on the market practically twice a year with open solicitations from our energy supply group to actually buy those extracts and the RECs that are required, percentage of each type and various Class 1, Class 2 that we can purchase. Again, that's done in a way through fairly large brokers. Our extract purchase program is very similar to what we've been purchasing RECs for many years. We put out a solicitation typically later in the year, and then get those prices back, select one or two or more suppliers of those, and then at another point in the year, typically earlier in the year, we kind of true up what we need in order to make the numbers work, if you will. So again, we're a big player in that market, as are the other investment utilities here in Massachusetts, the retail suppliers like the TransCanadas and the Constellations and the Direct Energy and all the rest. They also have the same obligation as a percentage of retail sales, which we do. I also want to mention the fact that in terms of solar energy, specifically for our customers, we do need to recognize that it's important to make sure our customers have an energy plan over time. A big part of the Green Communities Act that Chair Berwick did discuss earlier had a fairly large component of additional energy efficiency funding so that we can become essentially right-sized for our energy needs here in the Commonwealth to reduce our greenhouse gases in that way. And then once you're right-sized, then move on to different sources of on-site generation, solar being just one of those. I mean, there's significant energy efficiency rebates both on the gas and electric side, which I urge you all to take advantage of. There's significant dollars out there available for projects, and it really makes sense if you're looking to reduce your carbon footprint, greenhouse gas emissions, or frankly just your energy bill, you take the least expensive options first, which is typically efficiency, and then work your way up that cost line. But in terms of what National Grid does, we also have built 5 megawatts of solar. Again, part of the Green Communities Act that allows utilities to build up to 50 megawatts of solar. The sunset clause is rapidly approaching for that. And most utilities, only us and, well, actually the three utilities, Western Mass, Pittsburgh Gas and Electric, and National Grid took advantage of the program. Both us and Western Mass Electric have approximately the same amount, 5 megawatts. So the good news is we have a very good understanding of all the issues you have, the zoning, the permitting, the building inspectors, the permits you have to draw, all those exciting things that happen in the real world. We also got to work with our fellow sister utility at SR Electric on interconnection, because one of our largest projects, 1.3 megawatts, is at our Dorchester gas plant site right off of 93. That was exciting for us to understand just where most of you folks are when you're calling up looking to interconnect with the host utility. Again, we don't serve the Dorchester area of the state. So we were fortunate enough to see both sides of that. So we have some real understanding and respect, frankly, for what it takes to actually interconnect these large projects. Aleta talked earlier about 300 plus megawatts of solar projects here proposed. That's just in National Grid service territory. There's almost 800 statewide, and had been coming in at a clip of 5 or 10 megawatts per week at our company, just National Grid, which is approximately half of the state. So there's significant activity there, and the issue is the fact that the bulk of the activity are these large solar farms with no real outside load. Folks are proposing them in places where there's no electric load with the neighbors. So what happens is the infrastructure in that area is only been designed and operated and built for the load in the area, which was very small. In many cases, we have distribution circuits that can serve up to 8 megawatts of load that may only peak at 3 or 4 megawatts, but now we're looking at projects of that size being interconnected to those circuits. And it's very important that when we're all done and the project goes online, that the neighbors of these projects are not affected adversely with any sort of voltage regulation or power quality issues, which can occur. Folks who've seen, 5-minute traces of the power output of solar arrays know that on cloudy days, it's essentially a sawtooth blade power production curve. Where if you've got a 1 megawatt array, you can be at a megawatt at, approximately noon or 12:15. And when the cloud comes over, thank you very much for that. Was I loud enough without it? I got a little fuzz here too. But now we screwed. I was on a roll here. All right. At noon the cloud comes over. And for the older folks here who actually see the production curves, in terms of a minute or 5-minute resolution, you'll see that megawatt curve power drops off to 50 kilowatts. And back to 800 kilowatts a few minutes later, back to 200, and it goes rapidly back and forth. That rapid change in power output drags the voltage up and down that same circuit. And depending where you physically are in the circuit, if you're 10 miles away from our source, our substation, it's a much trickier interconnection than if you're sitting right next to the substation where the source is actually what we call firmer than it would be some 8 or 9 miles out away. So it is a very complicated procedure for us to review and properly study these projects so that we don't cause the neighbors problems. On top of that, the sheer volume of these projects has been just incredible. From a few projects just 3 or 4 years ago, the biggest project we were seeing were 200 and 300, 400 kilowatt arrays proposed by our friends here at Nexamp. And now we routinely see 6+ megawatt projects. We have a couple of 18 and 24 megawatt projects that we're working on now that have to now, because of the size of the project, go have a transmission interconnection, which is a whole separate animal. But it is something that we're working on. There's a DG working group that Chair Berwick's Department of Public Utilities convened. We started about 2 or 3 weeks ago. There's a meeting in North Andover this morning. which I think Jonathan and I are probably dashing up to right after we get out of here. But that's to try to figure out what can we do to streamline the process so we can set the proper expectations for our customers, and also to streamline the process internally so that we can process these quickly. As Chair Berwick said, we do have an obligation to interconnect, and I would use the term integrate, renewable sources into the distribution and transmission grid, because we really don't have a choice. The 80% reduction in greenhouse gases that's really requires all sorts of different opportunities. The energy efficiency, obviously, the first thing we want to work on, and then other very low carbon producing generation facilities such as solar. So with that, more than happy to answer questions as we go forward. You know, we did chat briefly about net metering. We'd be happy to share some thoughts on that if you're interested, but to keep this moving, David?
Excellent. Thanks, Tim, so much. And I think it's very helpful for you to kind of be able to speak to issues such as interconnection procedures, which people probably will be interested in hearing a little more about, net metering, how some of that is administered, and so forth. So that's very helpful. I guess now what I'd like to do is sort of turn really to the market perspective here with John's comments, because as Bram indicated, what the Commonwealth has done is essentially try to create a marketplace, if you will, for solar production activities, and has attempted to create a bandwidth within which there will be a market trading, a market price for solar credits, obviously looking to create a certain amount of efficiency within that framework. So with that, John, I'm very interested in hearing your company's experience with this marketplace, and whatever you can say to us about how the market is evolving, how prices are moving, how they're trading, give people a little bit of a feel for what does it mean to be producing solar energy and having RECs, what kind of revenue stream, and let me ask you as well to just clarify the distinction between the energy output and the renewable attribute output, which are two separate commodities.
Great, thank you, David. And so you've already heard about SRECs and interconnection, so again, thank you for staying to the end of the panel and having me here today. Nexamp, we're the largest solar develop, build, and operate firm headquartered in Massachusetts. We have 20 megawatts online as of last week in the state. 12 of those megawatts occurred in the last 16 months, to give you a sense of how fast the market is moving. Nexamp also has offices in 4 other markets besides Massachusetts. And I think it's 3 things that have contributed to Nexamp's success. Of course, is the hard work of the team I work with, but we couldn't have done it without National Grid and the other utilities interconnecting our systems and enabling net metering, as well as the state support for solar through a number of the policy measures you've heard about so far. So basically, the way I'm going to answer Dave's question and present the state of the state of solar in Massachusetts is through a 7-minute presentation where I'll cover some key data points reflecting on what it was like 6 months ago and where we are today. And then I'll go through some key development issues that are impacting solar developers, building owners, landowners, and our financing partners in terms of getting these projects done. So some key data points to put everything in perspective. In the United States, which is only a fraction of the global solar market, since the beginning of time, about 4,000 megawatts of solar project have been installed through the end of 2011. Forecasts indicate that an additional 2,000 to 3,000 megawatts of solar will be installed in the United States in 2012, almost doubling total installed capacity in the state.
I'm sorry.
80 megawatts of solar, approximately 80 megawatts of solar, not all of it's SREC eligible, have been installed in Massachusetts through the end of 2011. Depending on who you ask, another 50 to 100 megawatts could be installed by the end of 2012. Again, doubling the amount of solar. Putting it all in perspective, Massachusetts represents less than 5% of the U.S. solar market over the last couple of years. Project types are changing. Through the end of 2011, we saw very robust residential, robust commercial industrial solar installations, but a lot of the larger projects tended to be either funded by federal stimulus, i.e. a 1.6 megawatt ground mount installed at the city of Pittsfield wastewater treatment plant, or utility-owned projects, such as some of the projects that Tim talked about, including a 1 megawatt project in Whitensville, which I believe is still the largest rooftop mounted project in Massachusetts, but maybe not, depending on if anyone knows differently. In 2012, what we're starting to see is a lot more large, privately funded ground-mounted projects. A couple examples, we just turned on a 4.5 megawatt project in Westford. That's a partnership between Nexamp and Catharsis Private Investments. It's financed by Middlesex Savings Bank and Cambridge Savings Bank. Interconnection queue, you've heard a lot about this. I think at the beginning of 2011, you might have had a little bit more than 100 megawatts in the queue. By the end of the year, it was closer to 500 megawatts across all utilities. And halfway into 2012, based on data that I think through April, you have over 700 megawatts. The SREC requirement, at the end of 2011, it was 400 megawatts. When we talked to the state, when we talked to legislators, there was no mention of increasing that requirement. 6 months later, we've heard today, the DPU chair say earlier today that we need to expand the tools to support clean energy. Bram mentioned earlier that it's definitely not going to stop at 400 megawatts. We've heard key legislators also take a leadership role in starting to talk about what happens after 400 megawatts. The installed cost of solar throughout 2011, it fluctuated significantly because module prices dropped dramatically. But at its peak, a typical rooftop system might have been over $4 a watt installed. Today, we're seeing typical large, relatively clean rooftop systems at potentially under $3 a watt installed. So key development issues. 1603 tax grant. Are folks familiar with the tax grant? So basically, as part of stimulus, there's always been a 30% tax credit for solar, and the stimulus package said anyone who can basically put 5% down on a project by the end of 2011 can still get a 30% tax, well, a cash grant in lieu of the tax credit if they build their project by 2016. At the end of 2011, we didn't know if they were going to extend this or what we could do to basically what we call safe harbor or lock in this cash grant for as many projects as possible. And we and a lot of developers and investors invested significant sums of money in equipment to lock in this cash grant for projects. For better or worse, it doesn't look like the cash grant is going to be extended. And the fact that a lot of people have this kind of pent-up inventory is going to drive a lot of development or construction activity in 2012 and 2013. The other key development issue facing us all, and you hear a lot about, is site acquisition. How do we find good sites? How do we avoid these permitting issues? 400 megawatts is about 1,600 acres of land or rooftops in total. Massachusetts has about over 6 million acres of land and rooftops in total. And so my position is that there's a lot of good sites for solar that have yet to be realized. Fast forward 6 months to today, I think we still take that same position. Some issues that are arising is you probably want to avoid sites where there are neighbors. You want to avoid sites where there's any environmental issues. There's still a lot of good sites that are available. One of the technical issues is there's not a lot of good sites for solar that are trying to interconnect to a line where there isn't already another solar project in front of you, which could add to longer development timeframes and potentially other costs. Even if the state triples the requirement to 1,200 megawatts, that's only about 4,800 acres, which is still less than 1/1000th of the total land and building tech potential in Massachusetts. Interconnection. At the end of 2011, the volume had soared, and there was a backlog at the utilities with regard to the interconnection application processing and the construction of upgrades for projects. I think what we've seen is that the utilities are doing a good job in building up their capabilities and at least keeping the process transparent to their development partners in terms of where you are in the queue and what the next steps are. And as Tim acknowledged, the working group is going to help come up with some recommendations by the end of summer to potentially further improve that. Permitting. Significant variations for solar permitting across each of the municipalities. Again, if you pick a good site, it's a relatively straightforward process. If you have a complicated site, a lot of different things can happen. Property tax on solar. At the end of 2011, what we had realized is that each city and town basically had their own methodology for determining property tax. That's still true today, but there's been legislation passed by the Senate and potentially is going to be taken up by the House that potentially creates a standard payment in lieu of taxes for solar projects. The SREC market. So at the end of 2011, what we saw was a market that had limited forward activity, meaning people were transacting 2011 SRECs, but there wasn't a lot of forward activity 2012 and beyond, but there was some. And long-term contracting, trying to get a forward contract for more than 1 or 2 years was very challenging. And what we're seeing 6 months later is there's a lot more entities entering that market that are trying to make deals happen. It's what we see as a very forward activity in the right direction. Prices for SRECs are depressed, they're down. In some cases, they are below the floor that Bram talked about. However, because the installed costs of projects have also come down, you can still make a good return on a project if you basically balance costs with SRECs and with your net metering credit revenue, which I'll talk about next. The last SREC comment I had is that the market is, as designed, is very elegant, as Bram said, but I do believe that there are a few improvements that can be made to the SREC market that would help improve both the relevance of the floor in the market, as well as to encourage long-term contracting in the marketplace. Net metering credits. At the end of 2011, we were wondering, you had a 3% total cap, 2% for public, and 1% for private. When is that private cap going to be filled up? And fast forward 6 months later, I think we have the answer to that question. It's imminent, at least for National Grid, that the 1% cap will be fully allocated. And now we're starting to think about, well, when's that 2% for public going to be filled up? Is that going to be months, or is it going to be years, or something less? And a couple of things are happening. One is the legislation I spoke about also would increase the caps from 2%, 1% to 3%, 3%. It's supposedly going to be released by the House sometime this week. And the DPU and utilities are working on what is called a system of net metering assurance. So it'll help you understand whether you're under the cap or not prior to having an operational project, which is currently the case. And the DPU is also doing some good work to clarify some definitions around net metering projects.
John, for those of us who might not be familiar with what a net metering credit is, could you just provide a simple illustration of what is a net metering credit?
Absolutely. So in Massachusetts, we have what's called virtual net metering. So it allows for you to generate net metering credits, or essentially National Grid coupons at the meter tied to your solar project, and transfer those coupons to any other National Grid customer located in the same ISO load zone. So pretty much Western Central Massachusetts, same ISO load zone. So I can take a credit from Westford and sell it to Dudley Charlton Regional High School, which is tens of miles away, and basically sell them a coupon that they buy for cents on the dollar. So an example might be, I sell them a National Grid dollar, and they buy it for me for 80 cents.
But the point of net metering credits here, the use of the word net is essentially after consumption of the electricity produced by the solar system on site, if there's any left over that can be shipped to the grid, that's what essentially you would get net metering credits for. That's where you get essentially surplus revenue, so to speak, or revenue equivalent to what it would cost to actually buy that electricity on the retail market. So it's essentially excess consumption beyond on-site.
And just to talk to your question about the tariff, it is an issue, but there's plenty of supply out there that isn't impacted by the tariff, so we don't see the tariff discussions slowing down development here in and cost-effective development here in Massachusetts. And just to close on financing, obviously I don't want to steal any thunder from the subsequent panels, but we're encouraged by the number of investors that are both looking at this market and learning more about it, as well as that have actually transacted in this market. So we've done 20 megawatts over the last couple of years here in Massachusetts, which have been done through a full range of financing, from businesses' balance sheets to debt financing working with regional banks, national banks, and national energy investment firms.
Great. Good, John. Thanks so much. So let me just quickly, a couple of clarifying questions, and then I want to open it up to you. So if you've got questions, keep them in mind. In a moment, I'll ask you to raise your hands, and we'll get the microphone coming around to you. But Bram, let me come back to you and just ask you to pick up a little bit on what John was talking about. Talk a little bit about the auction mechanism. I know there is concern in the industry about whether it's really going to work. I don't think it's yet been tried, so we don't really have proof that it will work. But just give us a simple description of what it is and how it's supposed to work, and whether the agency is still feeling fully confident of it, or whether you're thinking about making any changes.
Well, we're definitely fully confident that it will work. It's a very innovative system, which is why I think a lot of people have questions about it, and even some have worries about it. But what it is that when the market doesn't, the SREC market, when the SREC market does not have enough buyers for SRECs, so you're a developer, you're owning SRECs and you want to sell them in order to create the revenue that you're counting on, but you don't find anybody that is willing to buy your SREC at the price that you would like to get. You can deposit at the end of the year your SRECs that are unsold in an auction account, which is held by DOER. Subsequently, we organize an auction for any market participant that wants to participate, and that's open. And the floor price of that market, of that auction, is the $300 that I referenced. Those $300 are $15 administrative fee, and $285 that go to the entity selling the SRECs.
And I just mentioned these are all prices in megawatt hours. So $300 per megawatt hour is the
you get one
floor price.
You get one SREC per megawatt hour of electricity that your PV installation generates, and that's the same for any renewable energy resource. Wind energy, 1 REC per megawatt hour. So the SRECs go into the auction. People bid on them, and the minimum price is $300. Now, if those if at the end of that auction, there's still SRECs that are unsold, we go into a second auction and organize a new auction with the same floor price, $300. But the system is designed cleverly in a way that as you go forward, and you're going to see that there's actually 3 rounds of auctions. But what we have done is each time that you go through
a round of auctions, it gets more attractive to buy the SRECs. Because on the one hand, the SREC that is bought gets an extended number of years that you can use it. Normally you can use an SREC only 1 year, and when you go through the auctions you can use it multiple years, and it increases as you go through the auctions. And also what we do is, and that's very important, what also happens is the SRECs that are deposited in the auctions, unsold, the target, the minimum standard that the retail suppliers will have to meet after the coming years is increased. So for the retail suppliers, like National Grid and their colleagues, they know that if SRECs go into the auction, the target next year will increase. And it is increased more and more as we go through the auction.
That is to say, future demand is increased.
So it's increasing the need to buy those SRECs. So not only do we make the SRECs more interesting, there's also an increasing created demand to buy the SRECs. So there's 3 rounds of auctions, which should take care of any unsold SRECs. Now, at the end of the 3rd round, if there's even then SRECs that are not sold, they go back to the owner, the original owner of the SRECs.
Great. Very good, thanks. I want to turn to the questions here from the audience, and since we have 1 microphone, I think what I'll do is just start in this end of the room, if you will, and take a few here, and then we'll go to the middle, and then we'll go to the end so the microphone can keep up with you. So do we have questions from this third of the room? Anyone here? Let's see, anyone further out with questions? Yeah, let's start way down here at the end. Please, if you'll stand up and give me the microphone. Can you see where he is? Waiting. Over here. So we'll start there and work our way across. Who else in this area has a question? I think one right here. Do we have another question here? Yes, I see that. All right. Please.
Hi, I have a question on net metering, and if the allocation is exceeded this year, I mean, does this mean that anyone starting a project now might end up with not being able to use net metering by the end of the year when it's placed in service?
Yeah, this our 1% cap for private is 51 megawatts. We're at almost 44 megawatts today. So we do expect by the end of June to be at our 51 megawatt 1% goal. The 2% public cap, which is 102 megawatts, because it's all based on our peak load of 5,100 megawatts, delivered load of 5,100, is only about 13 or 14 megawatts. So there's plenty of room under the public cap. But so when we hit the private cap, the tariff is clear, the regulation is clear, the green tax is clear. It's not offered anymore. So what then occurs is under the old rules of excess generation for any power plant, the utilities are obligated to buy that output under PURPA, the old Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act from the late 70s. And you're actually what we call a qualifying facility. Under the restructuring statute of 96 or 97, the definition of what it costs in Massachusetts is the hourly clearing price of the ISO New England, which today is trading at about 2.5 cents per kilowatt. So that's what occurs. So if we hit our cap June 30th, July 1st, when you come online, you will get paid for excess, but you will only be paid as a qualifying facility. Until such time as the cap is raised, if you've indicated a desire to go on net metering, and there's room under the new cap, then we could put you under that. But folks do have to understand that it's somewhat likely that there'll be a window of time where a project will come online, won't be able to take advantage of net metering until the cap is raised and the government signs the new bill, and we understand when the effective date is. The good news is that in the last round of regulation from the Department of Public Utilities, they saw this coming. So instead of having to rewrite all the regulations and redraft all the tariffs, all that work's been done. So when the law comes from us and it's effective this day, it will be effective that day. You don't have to wait for the regulations to be put in place. So it's not great news, but I think it's just what the regulations are out there require us to do as utilities. The other issue is, as John said, the virtual net metering, the allocation of credits is part of net metering services, so that's not available either. So, but the good news is, as a qualifying facility, you do get cut a check for the excess power. Where now it's you really have to monetize those credits in many ways, because we're not obligated to cut you a check for any of the net metering credits.
When is it determined when you're under the line? Is it when you receive the interconnection approval, or is it when you generate your first watt of power? What determines the deadline?
Well, before you answer, I'm going to ask you to get the microphone. And this gentleman here in the yellow shirt in the center here has a question. We'll go there next. All right, now you can answer, please.
What happens is that when you got the authorization to operate in parallel from the host utility, which means you got the assigned interconnection agreement, you paid all costs, if any, you provided the proper insurance certification, and you passed the critical witness test. Once all of that's been done and the meter has been set and operational, that's when we authorize the parallel operation of the system. And it's that day that if the cap is still open, you can get under it. If it's not open, you're not available to take net metering services.
Thank you. Yes, right here, please.
This question is for Bram. You said for the small communities choosing their own PV installers, how do they find the information for the installers? Do they have a list? Are there bids?
Yeah. So you're referring to the Solarize Massachusetts program. The different communities have issued RFPs, so requests for proposals from installers to serve as installer for the people in their communities that want to participate. My understanding is that most are finalizing the selection of installers. There's a couple that I think last week or 2 weeks ago had to go through another RFP because there was not enough interest. But overall, most of them are finalizing that now and are selecting who to work with.
Good, thank you very much. Right here we have a question.
I guess back on the net metering subject, is it practical to operate a solar project with no net metering cap? If you put it on top of a factory and you intend to use all the power in the factory, could you do that? The other question I have is, why is the net metering cap defined in terms of the size of the project when in reality perhaps a small portion of the power will actually generate net metering credits?
Well, the first question is, yeah, it is important that in order to properly size a solar array to maximize the value if net metering isn't available, that your projected output solar array for PV watts or whatever program most folks use matches as closely as possible the hourly usage of that host customer. Because ultimately, you've got a bidirectional meter reading two different quantities. One is reading what's flowing out, one's reading what's going in. And at various hours, so netting is actually taking those two numbers, taking the net at the end of the month of your bill, right? Without net metering, that doesn't occur. There's no netting of energy that occurs through the month. So if you have a solar project that's going to produce energy on a Sunday afternoon and the facility is closed, you will then, that will be the export power, which you'll be paid the wholesale clearing price for. But any hours that are coincident, where the generation is equal to or less than the electric load, is essentially worth the full retail credit, because the customer now does not have to buy that kilowatt hour from the system, get delivered by us or through an outside third-party competitive supplier. That was the first question. The second question, I'm sorry, could you repeat the second question?
I've got a 1 kilowatt facility, and I'm going to use 1 megawatt facility. I'm going to use on average 90% of the power on site. I'm going to export 10%. The net metering cap is defined in terms of a 1 megawatt facility.
Well, I congratulate for actually being a net metered customer as the rest of the country defines it. Because unfortunately here in Massachusetts, the solar farms have good, better, and different. They're promoting lots of renewables, meeting the government's goals. It's a great thing for us in the Commonwealth. However, because they are so large and there's no on-site use, they have taken up significant amounts of the cap. And we just need to understand that and move forward. But the legislation and regulations are clear. It's the nameplate capacity. So it's what the rules tell us.
Okay, we're getting a little tight on time. I have a lot of questions, so I want to take at least 3 or 4 more. So please have questions with short answers here. Okay, please.
Just very quickly, how long does it take to get an interconnection agreement, and when does that period start? At the end of construction, or at the end of design, or whenever?
And I think so net metering is only when all the construction, net metering is allowed only when everything's online and everything's done. In today's market, with the volume we're seeing, it can easily take 8 or 9 months for a study to be done for these large projects. All the smaller ones were in still real good shape in terms of processing this normal small residential, small C&I projects very quickly as per the tariff. It is the large projects again, and as John mentioned, we've got multiple projects in a very small geographic area. It's a very complicated process.
I'm wondering if the question is, what is the minimum that an applicant needs to know to be able to begin an application for an interconnection? In other words, what are the basic requirements for design in order to be ready to apply?
Well, the good news is every month there is a DG seminar hosted by one of the 4 utilities, which are on the DOER's website. So you can go to these seminars, it lasts most of the morning, and it walks you through all that. But ultimately, the best thing is to review the tariff. Section 3 of the tariff is only a couple 3 pages, and it describes the whole process.
Okay, great. We have a question here. Yes.
Yes, with regards to the SREC auction, if the auction is oversupplied with SRECs, how is it determined which SRECs get bought at the floor price and which get extended?
The auction, so any SRECs that are sold in the auction are proposed, so the revenue that is generated by that is proportionally distributed over who deposited in the auction.
Right. So in the auction, all the SRECs that are sold there are sold at a fixed price, $300. It's not a bidding on price. It's bidding on quantity. How many do you want to buy at that price? And once the quantities are bid, the department essentially prorates those across the available RECs in order to apportion them to use them all up.
Right, but I have a follow-up question to that. So you said there were 3 auctions and all the SRECs were sold. Then some of those SRECs go back to the original owner of the SREC. So do they go back proportionately, or and also, wouldn't you consider that a failed auction then if all the SRECs are unsold?
If all the SRECs are unsold, yeah, that would be
or if any portion of them are unsold, that would be a failed auction. If it's undersubscribed.
Yeah, any SRECs that are sold in the auction is a success, and the idea is to have all of them sold. So if that does not happen, that means that the auction mechanism did not work or not fully work as it is intended to. But we're confident that that will happen.
But aren't there only 4?
Hey, can I just ask you for just a second to hang on? We've got people lined up to ask questions, and he did give you an answer. I want to make sure we get a lot of people in. Please.
This question is for Bram and also for Timothy. We have a manufacturing facility in Vermont, and the local utility approached us with a slogan that if we do 25, 50, or 75% of the power, we can market and advertise that slogan. As a retailer with a manufacturing facility that is run with solar power in Massachusetts, we need to advertise and market that. We need a slogan as retailer businesses that the public will understand and realize that they're doing solar or wind power or whatever, and the products they're offering are manufactured with that. We need something we can carry across the state that means something to the consumer. That's a huge value to us. and I don't, in Vermont, the utilities did it. Of course, they fathered and came up with net metering first, and they've got some innovative ideas. Interestingly, they're doing the digesters with manure, and they're calling it cow power, and the state of Vermont utility is selling that. Okay, and believe it or not, it's very, very powerful if you're dealing with those communities. People go out of their way to do business.
Do you have a question, though?
My question is, can you, either Timothy or Bram, can they come up with a slogan that we can use as an industry? To market products that were produced with solar.
That's a good question. That's definitely an interesting suggestion. We don't have something like that currently. Like, it's just a marketing approach. It's maybe something actually for markets to jump on. Let's talk about that. It's interesting.
I like cow power. We've got a digester in Massachusetts too. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Hi, good morning. I'm with Workforce Central Career Center in Worcester, and I think this question is more so for Bram. Are there any particular incentives to contractors to hire unemployed Massachusetts residents?
I will have to pass on that. I don't know if there's anything specific for the solar industry to hire.
And then regarding, pardon me, sorry, thank you. Regarding the role of unions, I was just curious in either of the either solarized mass or the solar carve out, if there is a particular role for unions or if that's all really contractor based.
I don't know if there's a specific role for unions in there, other than in other similar industries. So I'm sorry, I have to pass on that.
Okay, we have a question here.
So my concern is zoning. That we have in the Mass General Laws, Chapter 40A, Section 3, that says that solar power shall not be prohibited or unreasonably restricted. And Jonathan, you can chime in on this as well. But I am concerned that as different regulatory agencies compete for attention, that they are eroding those zoning protections. That one site should only have 1 megawatt connected to the net metering rather than 6 megawatts. Or that certain areas of town should be restricted to 250 kilowatts. And this is an erosion of the zoning that is a law by regulation. So what will the state commit to? And on the other hand, we got strange bedfellows like Charlie Baker and Martha Coakley saying we can't afford the future because it's too expensive. So we have these forces trying to restrict us, but zoning is the fundamental concern, and how will that be protected? But I think I'd really like Jonathan to chime in on that and offer an opinion first of what you see out in the field, because you can get tied up with local permitting and moratoriums are being proposed, etc.
I'm going to ask you to stop there. Do we have responses from anyone here on the zoning?
Sure. I think Nexamp's position on this is poorly sited solar projects are bad for the industry. We believe that solar site selection should be kind of a top-down exercise, where you look at the characteristics that make a good solar project, you drill down on the map of the state, you identify projects. What we see happening too much is kind of a bottom-up type of solar exercise, where the site, a couple of people that are tied to that site, drive the solar project, and that site may not be a good place for a solar project. And so we're not supportive of those projects.
Yeah, and definitely second what John said. We have seen a couple of projects where people raise concerns. Some of them are concerned about the impact of electromagnetic fields on the health of people. Some of them are concerned over the noise of solar PV installations. So what we try to give as a message is that it's very important to site any kind of renewable, but also PV installation very thoughtfully and in a close communication with neighbors and local communities, so people are not
surprised, that they know what's coming, and also to make any effort that you can make as a developer to minimize any potential impacts. For example, site the inverters at a distance that they don't hinder anybody. And the noise of an inverter is, of course, minimal, but you don't want to sleep next to it. And keep good distances, respect safety, all those kinds of things. We're currently developing some guidance and information for people, for local communities, looking at PV installations on answers to questions that people might have to help them, to make sure that acceptance of PV installations is as high as possible. Because we want to go forward, and I think part of your question was also, what's the future? And it's been mentioned a couple of times already. We're seeing the 400 megawatts of the solar carve-out on the horizon. And while the design of the program was taking into account that markets evolve, and therefore that we didn't want to commit to eternity to have the same program. At the same time, we want to have the solar market still grow after 400 megawatts, and that's the quote that John quoted earlier. We want to see the market go beyond 400 megawatts. But how is a conversation that DOER will start between this and the coming months, and in full conversation with anybody that wants to chime in on that. Just a bit of perspective. 2 weekends ago, but just one thing, like the future. Like last weekend was exceptionally sunny in Germany, and they generated 50%, 50% of their power with solar energy. It was a weekend. I mean, so it was low demand, but still 50%, pretty impressive. And their grid did not collapse. So, not to say that we have to be Germany, but it gives some perspective.
Yeah, there's a vision for the future. I know there were more questions out there, and I can only say I'm sorry that we couldn't get to every single one of them, but I do want to ask the three panelists who've just been terrific, if you wouldn't mind just staying here or near the podium, near the stage, for a few minutes during the break so that people with questions might be able to get you one-on-one. With that, I'd like to invite everyone to join me in thanking the panelists.